I have to ask, you all are, you're friends, right? You are each other's intertexts in, you're in interlocutors in the book. Were you talking with each other as these books were coming into being?
Yes. In fact, I don't know. It makes me, this has only come up once, I think, but I think that someone has suggested that the texts are somehow, I don't know, or like maybe has prodded to see if they might be at odds. I don't think they're, I think they're not at odds at all. I think it's I think of it as a comrade project. But I don't want to speak for you, Michelle. But I feel like we evolved the thinking somewhat as comrades.
Mm-hmm. I see the two books as being very complementary. I can think of people, either my family or students or friends, who I would give one book as opposed to the other, but generally give one first. But to the extent to which, like, what's at stake in a lot of those conversations I have with friends or students is like getting them to really denature the given, right? And just sit with the idea that the family is itself not only something that could be abolished, but something that is contingent in its ongoing and past constitution. Is it's one of those things where, like, they need to hear it over and over again in different ways and from different angles. And I think it sort of precipitates through in sort of different temporalities for both books, but together I think that it's really a tour de force package.
Thank you. That makes me happy to hear.
Yeah. I read Sophie's book first. I was teaching it, and I guess I didn't even really teach it. I assigned it, and then you showed up in my class and talked to my students about it, and they got very interested in family abolition. And in fact, I was talking about it in the last week or so when I'm teaching a class on Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and it was really interesting to be able to have the language of, like, abolish the family, abolish the police, and to be able to talk about that in thinking about just like what Marx is up to and thinking about the project of abolition, like that they had that, especially because some of my students had already, had read your book, Sophie, so they were taking it in that direction. But for me, it feels very much also like, that they're complementary projects, that there's a, and you get this sort of clarion call in some ways from Sophie. Like, and again, I would like Patrick saying, I would give, it's like, does somebody need like the systematic, like, here, I'm going to walk you through this argument so that by the end you have no choice but to agree that communist social reproduction is the only way forward. Like that's Emmy's book. But it's, reading them together was really, one amplifies the other in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, I think the difference is probably there are small ways in which we differ in terms of what we actually say, but I think the main difference is probably just the genre. It's different genres of project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine was actually commissioned as a pamphlet. Was the phrase used?
I think that's all accurate. There are critiques of the family and forms of family abolition circulating today that I disagree with, that I think have, some truth to them or a moment of wisdom in them, but that I am at odds with in important ways. And Sophie's excellent short book is not one of those. Like, I really love Abolish the Family very much and find it enormously helpful and quite resonant with my interests and my political and theoretical commitments. And as Sophie said, really very much think of them as us as comrades and them as complementary projects. And that they are obviously quite different stylistically in a way that, I imagine Sophie's book is much more engaging and accessible to people in many ways. But I'm really glad, like, it wasn't that long ago that family abolition was basically unheard of in any serious political circles anywhere. And that I think that the more people, the better, writing about it and thinking about it and sort of creating the space for asking the sorts of questions that are difficult to really meaningfully grapple with in other frameworks.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I'm absolutely delighted to introduce two thinkers and writers that I very much admire, Sophie Lewis and Emmy O'Brien. Sophie Lewis is a writer and independent scholar living in Philadelphia. Her first two books, both published by Verso, are Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, and Abolish the Family, a Manifesto for Care and Liberation. Sophie's essays and articles appear in academic journals like Feminist Theory, as well as in magazines like the London Review of Books and newspapers like the New York Times. Sophie's doctoral thesis about gestational labor is from Manchester University. She now teaches short courses on critical theory as a para-academic at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and has a visiting affiliation with the Center for Research on Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also excited to say that her third book, Enemy Feminisms, which I believe she has been teaching about for Bisser as well, is forthcoming from Haymarket in January 2025. So that's a little bit about Sophie. Emmy O'Brien writes on capitalism and gender freedom. She has two books, Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communizing of Care, and a co-authored speculative novel, Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. She also co-edits two magazines, Pinko on gay communism and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. Her work on family abolition has been translated into Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, Catalan, and Turkish. Emmy is also a practicing psychotherapist and a psychoanalyst in formation. She's currently studying at the Pulsion International Institute for Psychoanalysis and Psychosomatic Psychotherapy in New York City. She also teaches part-time on queer studies and capitalism at New York University, where she completed her PhD. Welcome, Sophie and Emmy. We are so delighted to have you here.
We're just so happy to have you.
Hello. Great to be here.
Thank you very much for having us. I've admired Ordinary Happiness for a long time. I think you all are just doing a great deal to popularize and make accessible and make engaging and lively the world of psychoanalysis for many, many people. And I've admired the work, and I'm very glad to be able to be here.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank
and I want to say that the idea for this episode has been, I'm going to use a Sophie word, gestating for quite a long time, since the very first seminar of the Psychosocial Foundation on the family problem. And that's, at least for me, when I really started to have family abolition. I already had you both on my radar as writers, but this project. And we're just so happy to have the both of you in conversation. Let's get into it, shall we?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit, if you would, about how you made your way to thinking about families and family abolition, as well as to psychoanalysis. If that's, I mean, I know at least for Emmy, that is, something that is really central to your work. But if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't have an origin story for psychoanalysis, so but I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I came to family abolition in a roundabout way, actually, through theoretical and political study. So I've been in communist study circles for many, many years. I was involved in editing a reader called Revolutionary Feminisms through the Communist Research Cluster. And it collected together primary essays by revolutionaries at different historical moments, more or less from the 1890s into the 1980s. And sort of I tried to really think about the relationship between gender and sexuality in the revolutionary anti-capitalist project. So anarchists, communists, Black nationalists, and then various liberatory movements centered around gender and sexuality. And one of the startling things that I found as I was working on that reader was that over and over again, many, many different people and movements identified what they were fighting against and what they needed to overcome as the family. And that was the starting point. And the family as a nexus of capitalism, of white supremacy, of private property, of anti-queer injustice, of the creating binary dualities around gender and sexuality. It just popped up again and again and again in manifestos. And sort of the first question that I really grappled with was an historical one that led into this essay and endnotes that I did, and then the historical section of family abolition. And that was, what do they mean and why did it keep changing? Because throughout there, what they mean by family changes a lot, and their prescription for its overcoming changes a lot. So my first big task was trying to come up with an account and eventually a causal material account where the changing meanings of family, and hence the changing meanings of overcoming the family or family abolition, mapping that onto the changing dynamics of capitalist development. Oh, and I used a periodizing framework from this French collective, and it really trying to think about how the capitalist development changed, how the changing dynamics of white supremacy and private property and class relations, and then how that transformed the structure and meaning and experience of the working class family over the last 150 years. And hence, in turn, what revolutionaries needed to fight against, what they imagined overcoming, and how they articulated that shifted as well. And so my first big task was historical. And then as I was working on that, it became increasingly clear to me that for a long time, I've been thinking about queer Marxism and trans communism, and thinking about queer and trans struggle in struggles against capitalism, and that the family provides a very, very powerful analytic tool to be able to recognize the changing dynamics of queer and trans people under many, many names at different moments historically, that it's through the family very often that the forces of production, the experience of work, the organization of property and society ends up having a profound impact on how people experience and live their sexuality. So that family abolition became a way for me of trying to theorize how revolution, anti-capitalist struggle might actually unfold, and has unfolded and could unfold in the dynamics of our intimate and personal lives. That there's so much writing about the role of the state, thinking about changing capitalism, and really recognizing this in historical struggles and in how we think about revolution, and that we really needed a whole research project, an expansive effort to think about revolution in our intimate and personal lives, to link it into other kinds of revolutionary thinking. In terms of psychoanalysis, I've, like a lot of people, I've been reading psychoanalysis for 20 years, mostly Freud and Lacan in my case, and did a long analysis that was very helpful to me and had a huge beneficial impact on my own mental health. And I completed my PhD in more or less Marxist sociology and queer studies in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And all the academic jobs disappeared briefly. All my interviews were canceled. And I was always very stressed out as an academic. And I realized that I had a social work degree and that I loved psychoanalysis, and I thought I'd give it a shot. So it was a professional shift to getting a job as a therapist and beginning psychoanalytic training, which was 3.5 years ago. And I've never been happier. That psychoanalysis is very unusual in providing an extremely intellectually vibrant world of people studying and thinking and talking together that is largely non-competitive and interestingly not determinant of their ability to make a living. Unlike academia, right? Where people are constantly competing each other and constantly anxious about jobs. Like, we all just do our jobs as therapists or analysts, as the case may be, and then we show up and study together. And the studying is incredible. It's been quite transformative and very rigorous for me. I'd like to think that there were historical moments where communist struggle was at a pitch that many, many people were in serious study groups and serious intellectual efforts to try to understand class society. But in our world right now, where I've encountered this sort of non-academic, largely non-institutional world of people thinking very hard, is in psychoanalysis. And I think the fact that we're all thinking very hard in relation to human suffering is very clarifying in lessening sort of competitive, imaginary status ego games. and providing a way through for actually grounding and motivating what we're trying to understand.
I sort of started off as a student of English literature, and I, was taught a lot of sort of critical theory tools for literary analysis as an undergraduate before I switched over to studying political theory and environmental and human geography, believe it or not. That was how I did my eventual sort of study of, human pregnancy from a kind of communizer, feminist, sort of anti-work, Marxist sort of standpoint. But initially, I think in my, childhood and adolescence, and then, the sort of undergraduate obsessions that came out of that, I was really fascinated. I read constantly when I was young, and I was quite struck, I think, even at a young age, about the ubiquity of anti-family themes in Western culture and civilization. It's just sort of this almost universal kind of background hum of pessimism, extreme pessimism about the family form. And yet that pessimism and the sort of the relatability of experiences of misery represented in novels, in TV shows, in films, and so on, and in popular jokes and so on, seems to be almost like a safety valve to prevent the possibility being discussed on a mass level that this could be different. There's no actual necessity for life and social reproduction to be organized into this privatized unit. So, I mean, eventually in 2022, when I wrote Abolish the Family, I suggested the family is a form of organized scarcity, right? It's a form of organized care scarcity. But I think, the way I came into that was partly just having critical utopian sort of instinct or something, about novels that I related to intensely. And even now, I've just read 2 novels by the Norwegian sort of literary sensation. I'm going to mispronounce it. Vigdis Hjorth. So Will and Testament, and then Is Mother Dead? And that's it just hits me like a nail bomb. These descriptions of intense familial pain that get at the sort of structural, captivity of the psyche or something in the family form. Anyway, that's intense because this novelist is writing about her experience of child sexual abuse within her family. And it's very obviously biographical, but her sister has gone and published a counter novel refuting her version of reality, right? So that it's very much meta, kind of becoming a fight about the family by the family in Norwegian civil society. I love this stuff. So I just wanted to throw that out there as my literary background because, I'm also someone who read Michelle's revolutionary feminism reader and then sort of developed my politics in a direction that, that became not just feminist in the sort of vaguely liberal way of my adolescence, which even then, even pre sort of, Marxism in my life, I think I probably had the happenstance of encountering the more sort of full-throated elements of the 60s and 70s Western feminist moment. Kate Millett says that the primary institution of patriarchy is the family. Even Betty Friedan, before she does a 180, talks about the family as a structural sort of form of oppression and captivity. And so for me, it was fairly, for some reason, I didn't realize how rare and how erased, how rare it was for people to remember this history of feminism thinking of itself together with gay liberation as fundamentally and definitionally an insurgency against the private household, right? And then when I was introduced to Marxism, I think somebody quite hostile to Marxism sort of told me, as though it would put me off, that the Communist Manifesto contains this infamous proposal of the communists to abolish the family.
Right.
And so it was one of the first things I learned, actually. I thought it was extremely orthodox Marxism. I still say that sometimes as a sort of, I suppose I'm possibly trolling, but I think of family abolition as
not a radical interpretation of that text. No. I don't think.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was a little bit of a hodgepodge of moments, but a very important text for me as well was the Cyborg Manifesto of the mid-'80s by Donna Haraway, a very sort of socialist text, which has a critique of kinship in it as the governing metaphor for social justice and transformation. So I've had a suspicion of the way that all forms of relation get subsumed in political theory into the format of kin and kin making and so on. So that's also part of my background, I suppose, together with the fact of having a father who happened to be extremely explicit about his biological investment in his own, self-replication and his quite explicit framing of his children and progeny as a form of quasi-property was unusually sort of unveiled, I would say. And since I read Haraway, I also was, quite aware of the feminist biological critiques of the very idea that reproduction happens as such in the human species in that sense, right? And the last thing I'll note is that when I wrote Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, my first book about family abolition, in a sense, I mean, it's not always discussed that way, but I see the two books I've written so far as part of the same project, more or less part of the same thought, maybe even, although I put the cart maybe a little bit before the horse. So Full Surrogacy Now and Abolish the Family perhaps would have more logically gone in the opposite order, because I think I presupposed a family abolitionist politics when I wrote Full Surrogacy Now. But to my surprise, a fair number of people ended up reading Full Surrogacy Now, and I ended up having a lot of conversations, which put me in touch with the conversations that ought to have happened to inform me what sorts of explanations and qualifications would have been useful for the reader, and also the parts of the argument specifically about the racialization of the family that needed to be worked on more and strengthened more. But Full Surrogacy Now, to be clear, is a book about pregnancy, not because pregnancy is the only place to get into the family at all, right? But it's a place. I look at the contract pregnancy industry, which is the sort of the small emerging sphere where human pregnancy is market mediated, and waged, to think about what that new phenomenon can do and can tell us and can do politically, potentially, as a form of sort of making visible the way that the sausage of natural kinship is made and the way that, human gestating is labor, even when it's unwaged and sort of subsumed under the category of motherhood, which again, feminists used to talk of as a patriarchal institution, right? Motherhood, which is why I also theorize about mothering against motherhood, which is an echo of a phrase from the 70s popularized by Adrienne Rich. But the whole impetus for the project was one line in the Wages for Housework Manifesto. Wages for housework, or wages against housework, strikes me as a still not sufficiently digested revolution within unorthodox Marxism or Marxism, where the way that capital accumulation sort of as a circuit runs through the unwaged sphere of care and the unwaged household is sort of insisted upon, and the immortal lines of the manifesto, like they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work, still gets misunderstood, misinterpreted, reacted against allergically across the board on the left. But I think it's so brilliant. What has never been discussed, to my knowledge, in great detail, apart from my attempt to do so, is a line that comes just afterwards. Every miscarriage is a work accident. And so my whole project was an attempt to bring pregnancy into the center of the wages against housework framework. Yeah. And I think wages for housework is not typically or was not typically referred to as a family abolitionist moment. in feminism or Marxism, but it very clearly is.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to make sure that we get to do a little bit of like ground clearing and defining our terms before we go any further. And so I want to ask first a really broad question in terms of definitions, and then also get a little bit technical. So for an audience that is not, like the two of you, immersed in Marxist theory, can you tell us a little bit about what it means to say abolish the family or to advocate for family abolition? And in particular, I want, and we will definitely get to talk about some of the other, historical antecedents or other theoretical inspirations that you both draw on. But I was hoping we could talk in particular about this idea of abolition, which is very important to both of you, and which you both draw on, the Hegelian and then the Marxist idea, Aufhebung, right? Which is this very important and specific and elusive German word that means at once, to nullify or cancel out, to preserve or to keep, to elevate and to lift up. So can you tell us a bit about this idea of abolition and of family abolition? Like, what does it mean to say abolish the family?
So for me, in the most sort of succinct way of putting it, abolition of the family is a vision for deprivatizing care or communizing care. The traditions of abolition, it's interesting. Perhaps Michelle and I will say slightly different things here. So this is how I understand it for me. Aufhebung, as you say, with its very sort of intriguingly intention meanings of sort of destruction, negation, preservation, actualization, transformation. It's typically sort of, or instinctively the case that one would think that that's not what's in play when we're talking about abolishing the police or abolishing prisons, right? The forms of abolition that have been brought into popular and mass, even mainstream consciousness, through amongst other things, the George Floyd uprising recently and the other sort of uprisings for Black lives recently. For me, I have an interpretation that differs a little bit, right? I think listening to the philosophers of abolition today, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and others, I understand the account of history that abolition offers us to be one about the building, the making present of the world that actually meets the needs that the target of your struggle only purports to meet, right? So when you're talking about the whole system of society based on slavery, you have a form of abolition of humanism, of slave humanism, right? You have a movement that's saying humanism would be a really good idea, bro. We're literally commodities. Your humanism is a travesty of what it purports to stand for. And so by destroying that society, you're actually sort of inventing a form of humanism worthy of the name for the first time. And that's why abolition is the name for that historical process. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about prisons or the police, the things that those institutions or systems are purporting to offer humanity are things like safety and justice, right?
Yeah.
And the police and the sort of criminal justice system under a class society do not, deliver, safety and justice in any true or meaningful sense. So abolition is the word for what we do that does not, in fact, involve primarily going out and setting fire to the precincts and the prisons themselves, although that is likely part of the process. Abolition, sort of for better and for worse, is a lot harder or a lot more than that process of targeting the actual institutions or buildings involved or people or what have you, right? It's the process of building the infrastructure that really would give us and embody for us a justice or a safety worthy of the name for the first time in history. And that's why I do say that it's the same abolition. It's the same kind of abolishing, because what family abolition is doing with care, in a sense, is abolishing it. Like it's saying care is an important, even a beautiful ideal. You know, the fact that family is the way that we attempt to meet that need is a catastrophe. And the fact that family is very materially, in myriad instances, kind of the only thing that so many people have, that is the problem that family abolition names and tries to respond to seriously. And so family abolition is saying, yeah, care would be a good thing. How do we build the infrastructures or the systems, the institutions, the system, the mode of production, and maybe the system of social relations that would rise to the challenge of that human need? Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I was thinking about how, listening to both of you describe how you've come to this work and to these topics, how these different trajectories have brought you to this common object, right? And whether those strands have been the oral history or the sociological history or the human geography or literary exposure or autobiography, it all condenses around this object, which, as you were just saying, Emmy, right? It seems both straightforward and at least is a word that occurs very frequently, namely this idea of the family, but which is not, in fact, a straightforward given term. And it occurs to me that like psychoanalysis seems like a very ideal frame, at least, for thinking about the ways in which our experience of this term are not actually given. So in this phrase like family abolition as such, right, or the call to abolish the family, are a whole other series of paradoxes, right? Insofar as that people are, you know, if you're brought up in psychoanalysis, clinically speaking, or you have an interest in psychoanalysis, you are, of course, focusing on this thing called the family, right? And you are focusing specifically, too, if you're reading Freud or something else, on these 19th century accounts of the family, where the family does not look anything like the family that we know today, right? When there are governesses coming and going and or, you know, strange aunts are visiting, et cetera. This is not the same thing as like the nuclear Levittown family of, you know, husband, wife, 2 kids, fractional pets or whatever, right? And so to the extent to which like psychoanalysis on the one hand highlights that the family is a source of trauma and can be a source of trauma and is also the place where the individual is sort of subjectivized or subjectified into the broader social link, it seems to call for the idea of, well, actually the family is a thing that can accommodate all these different types of unhappiness. That is, it's a dynamic, not given, eternally constituted quantity. At the same time, though, psychoanalysis seems to also speak to or allow us to maybe get a handle on the very taboos that you were sort of talking about, or the resistances to the very idea of thinking about the family in sort of a certain way, or as being contingent. And above all, when it comes into contact with this word abolition. And in this sense, I was thinking about like, even prior to George Floyd or to any of the 2020 sort of uprisings, when I've heard calls to abolish something just in everyday sort of normie discourse. And generally speaking, I can only ever think of it in terms of single policy propositions, right? Like abolish the death penalty, abolish some sort of tax that your community is imposing on some product, right? It's always tethered to a kind of like a specific intervention. And then when you speak of it in broader terms, or it's articulated in a way that people will think has some kind of stridency, and you're talking about like abolishing the monarchy or abolishing the UN, it immediately sounds destructive in a very narrow way. And thus, I think, as you were just getting at, part of this seems that latter problem, which compounds the problem of like the ambiguity of what the family is or has historically meant and the taboos we have about not thinking about that, is the way in which this term abolish reflects a certain impoverishment in the English language relative to the term in the German, which carries many other different kinds of meanings, as you've just been unpacking.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be nerdy about it, I would say that well, yes, exactly. You're right. I can't just say this because it's how people use the word abolish. But I guess stubbornly, I'm insisting on using the word abolish, and I'm not the only one, to mean this sort of dialectical thing.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people saying abolish, I would say, perhaps pedantically, but I think it's important and correct as well, they actually mean prohibit,
right,
or
negate,
overthrow.
just that,
They simply mean negate. Yeah.
It's a call to demystify this thing that is actually a site of tremendous mystification. And in some ways, like this thing that's should be like the ultimate Heimlich thing, your family, is actually profoundly strange, not really just about your family when you think about it, and also does social work on a whole lot of other levels that we need to sort of interrogate.
I think what you say raises many, many complex questions that are hard to sort of speak to all at once, that I'm not exactly sure. Like, the problem of the family in psychoanalysis is a very profound and subtle question. And I think there's a lot of ways of drawing on it, but I think it's important to not too easily sort of collapse these tendencies and distinctions and frameworks into each other. That, in parapraxis, we focused the first issue on the family problem, and we did a seminar study on it, and it raised many, many very interesting ways of reading the history of psychoanalysis, partially as a critique of the family, as a denormalization of the family, as a recognition of the sort of tangled, unconscious violences that structure and contain family life, and the social history of the family in the evolution of capitalism since the late 19th century as really having a profound and determinant impact on key aspects of psychoanalysis. I think there's many ways of approaching that, and that psychoanalysis at its best is very much a breaking open of the normalization, of the naturalization, of the assumption of the family as a place of unambivalent care and love and support and normative human development in many ways. It's the sort of relationship between this and family abolition is not a simple one.
Yeah.
That psychoanalysis is only at rare moments a theory of revolution.
Yes.
And family abolition resonates and intersects with many, many important critiques of the family as they circulate in society, many important efforts to challenge or transform or rethink the family. But it's also a kind of limit in all that. The family abolition is also a commitment to fundamentally overcome private property as a way of organizing social life. That the generalization of human care, of the support and care that we all need to survive, as widely and freely available throughout society and institutionalized throughout our lives, calls on a fundamental overcoming of so much about how we organize society. One way that I've talked about it a little bit with people, so in the first 3 chapters of my book, I provide sort of 3 definitions of family. And in each case, what must be overcome and what must be preserved is different. And Sophie did an excellent job laying out Aufheben and its meanings, and Abby, in your question. But that who you love should not affect your access to housing and material well-being, right? And who you happen to be related to should not affect your chances of flourishing in life. And that seems a sort of very basic ethical principle, but I think many people, it would resonate with them, but it would require a wholesale and profound transformation of society. And there are like reforms and organizing efforts we can do in the present that gesture towards that. And family abolition is a way of trying to theorize that as a leap and as a limit and as a gap beyond sort of what is readily available in the present. In terms of, Sophie alluded to us having slightly different frameworks on how we think about abolitionist traditions. For me, this my thinking on this partially comes out of debates around Black Marxism and the Black radical tradition, that I kind of, as a white communist, it feels very important to me to not too easily collapse the Black revolutionary tradition and Black freedom struggle in the United States into how I understand Marxism and socialist politics. That I really see the Black freedom struggle in the United States and the Americas as absolutely central to the communist endeavor, but that there are ways that it is in tension with and supersedes and is in sync with the Marxist and socialist tradition. Not least because many of the most important figures of the Black radical tradition spent much of their lives as socialists and Marxists and communist thinkers in one way or another. So maintaining a certain gap, a certain space of tension feels important to me politically. So the way that I articulate it And, this overlaps with key elements of what Sophie said, is that there are broadly two grand abolitionist traditions. One is Hegelian Marxism and the notion of Aufheben, the sort of recognizing that there's a kernel that needs to be preserved and unleashed and developed, and an element to be destroyed, and that these are in dialectical relation to each other in an object, so that the abolition of the state requires a radical proliferation of means of organizing social life and making collective decisions. The abolition of the wage is actually the freeing of human creative potential. And then the other grand abolitionist tradition is the Black freedom struggle in the Americas, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of Jim Crow, the abolition of mass incarceration, the abolition of policing. And that in this, it's very easy to sort of take abolition to mean destroying something, like let everyone out of prison, destroy the prisons. And in all cases, there has always been an element of preservation and development in this thinking. There's always been a vision of what collective human freedom might look like on the other side of slavery. And key elements of that vision, including economic sustainability, of access to land and the means of production, for example, and it did not come to pass. It was crushed with the counter-revolution against Reconstruction. But there's always been this element of creating something else. And then something that strikes me is that many of very important abolitionist thinkers actually spent significant time as Hegelian scholars, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, has a very deep engagement with Marxism. And that Hegelian thinking, that this sort of setting up this opposition between these two abolitionist traditions, they've also always been in relation to each other. They've always had something very important to do with each other. And of course, Marxist thinking was really shaped by studying the struggle against slavery in the Americas. And Hegel's thinking, there's been some great research on this, was shaped by the Haitian Revolution.
Right. You cite the Susan Buckmore's book.
Two traditions are in dialectical relation to each other. They're not atomized and isolated, but they're also not exactly the same thing. Broadly, I think of family abolition sort of in the Hegelian sense, that as a generalization of the care that's available in the best families, and really making that a universal human right in many ways, and trying to think about what kinds of social institutions and ways of organizing society could really make that freely available, and that requiring a sort of massive transformation in how the private family is currently organized and constituted, and an overcoming of the private household as a sort of key economic link of organizing property. And there's a lot more to say about all that. But I think putting family abolition in dialogue with police and prison abolition is very important to me politically. That in many ways, police abolition has been an essential and crucial revolutionary horizon that's emerged in popular and mass thinking in the United States during and after the George Floyd rebellion, and that this kind of revolutionary tendency has a very powerful insights to offer in trying to understand American society and what a free society could look like. That throughout my book, I tried to, and Sophie does this very, very well, deeply embed and engage and in dialogue with the Black freedom struggle as a core reference point in how I tried to theorize the family and family abolition. I perhaps as much as Marxism.
Yeah.
To produce some parallels vis-a-vis the question of police abolition that I think may be germane for our audience, right? I think one thing that we have encountered here talking about police abolition and the way the phrase like, well, abolish the police both lands and sort of sometimes doesn't land. And I want to be clear, I'm not interested in doing like critique of sloganeering or any of that shit. I think that's always tendentious, but it oftentimes seems to pivot on a sort of a discursive formation or a series of like reflexive investments where the police are sort of taken to be a given inevitable, non-negotiable quantity, and that two, if they're removed, it's like taking the keystone out of an arch and it's assumed that everything else is going to fall. And then there are correlative problems where people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, if we take the police away, who am I going to call to evict my tenants? Or who's going to show up to beat the shit out of this guy who doesn't look like he belongs in my neighborhood, right? But even on that level, it operates on this sort of crucial series of nested sleights of hand where even as institutionally, other sources of support or function are withdrawn, and the police literally become like the only thing. So it's an arch that's just a keystone, if you want to think about it that way. I don't really know if that analogy works. People come to understand the police as standing in for this thing that they would like to think of as safety, when in fact what it really produces is like security in some sort of capitalist mode that's very indifferent to people's actual well-being. So in an analogous way here, and I'm thinking that just on the level of like defense mechanisms and sort of desires to not talk around certain things, or the desire to mystify certain things, we could see much of the work being done about the family in a similar mode is to invoke an idealized eternal institution, which is understood as being sort of non-negotiable, but which is actually linked to a whole series of other social and historical entailments. And that sort of mystification hinges upon, well, precisely what I think you both really, really drill down on in such an excellent way, namely the fact that we associate the family, for better or for worse, and despite our actual experiences of real families, with this thing called the provision of care, and with like mechanisms for caring for people, and our experiences of love, but also with social safety net senses of care. And that at that point, the call for abolition is not just like, well, get rid of the police and keep a police-shaped hole in your heart, right? Or get rid of families and now there are no benefits even for people who would previously, have just been relying on like family benefits via the state. It's a much more difficult process of relating to this institution, to our assumptions about this institution, and to the way in which that institution relates to other institutions, but also into like the libidinal economics of care, or of being safe, or of simply living together.
This is related to what you're just talking about. I mean, something I really think will strike readers is that both of your books, although they are coming out of this Marxist tradition and thus dealing extensively with class, but they're also dealing really carefully and intersectionally with categories of race, gender, and sexuality. And in particular, the writing of Black feminist theorists, ranging from Hortense Spillers to Tiffany Lethabo King, looms really large for both of you. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about the influence of these thinkers on your work, and about the ways that, historically speaking, conceptions of the family have been constituted in relationship to whiteness and, relatedly, to the accumulation of property.
Sophie has a lot to say on this as well. I'll talk a little bit about the historical element of it. I have found many of the theories developed by Black feminist scholars to be enormously helpful in thinking about the history, the racial history of the family politics. So I spend a lot of time trying to unpack thinking about the family under slavery and settler colonialism, and recognizing the centrality of what Black feminist and Afro-pessimist scholars call natal alienation, the separation, the enforced separation between mothers and children under conditions of slavery by slave owners, as profoundly fragmenting and disrupting and destroying the relationships of care between Black people under conditions of slavery. And that the family was systematically constructed as an idea, as a conception, as a way of thinking that excluded Black people. That the family in this context was very much on the side of slave owners as a way of organizing and thinking about the property of slave owners, and that the family as a normative conception, as a legal institution, as a way of thinking was defined against Black life. And Black feminists have debated in very rich and complex ways how to make sense of this. Whether Angela Davis emphasizes the heroic efforts of Black people to still care for each other and form familial relations of various sorts under conditions of slavery. Horton Spillers really problematizes and questions the concept of family applied to this context. And Tiffany Letta-Bokin rejects altogether in many ways the family as a normative white supremacist concept. And these are all different ways of parsing the same material, the same case context. There's another historical moment after the overthrow of slavery that there's been recently more attention to, but it is the experimentation and innovation around care relations by Black people during Reconstruction. So we know a little bit about this from Union pension records, that if a soldier was in the Union Army and killed, their wife and children were entitled to a pension. So you had government workers going to freed Black people's homes across the South, trying to figure out who the wife and children are. And what they found was quite shocking, which is that many, many Black people formed what were at that time radically non-normative households in the aftermath of slavery. It's very common for people, married couples, to be separated during slavery and to have to pursue new relationships in a context that a divorce was extremely uncommon in white America. And after slavery, people got together in really complex and rich and diverse ways. They would partner up without any intention of marrying or necessarily living together for a long term, which is now quite common, but really wasn't in the 1890s. They would, in some cases, get together both with their former spouses and their current dates. People were much more comfortable having children out of wedlock, having long been excluded from legal marriage as an institution. And so there was a richness of family diversity and different experiments with care relations during Black Reconstruction. And then this is also underappreciated in the literature, that there's during Jim Crow, a key part of the Jim Crow land tenancy system of sharecropping in the United States that Black people were subject to, as well as brutal racial terror and legal segregation. So this really consolidated by the 1890s and lasted into the mid-20th century. One of the institutions of sharecropping is that it was legally required that Black people enter into heterosexual marriages by their landowners, a requirement by their landowners, in order to be able to rent land, so that heterosexuality and a normative family structure was systematically imposed on Black life. And then this moment, the Great Migrations, extending roughly from World War I into the 1960s, with the large number of Black people moving to urban areas and moving to the North and West. And in this new context, Black people often chose not to marry. And that's been a central question of debate in white supremacist thinking, in liberal white thinking, in Black feminist thinking, is how to understand the organizing of Black life, often in female-headed households. And in this context, the questioning, the problematizing, the redefinition and rethinking of what the family is has been a very, very essential part of the development of Black radical feminist thinking since the 1960s. And Sophie does excellent work in thinking about this in the context of second wave feminism and after. But just sort of broadly, that this whole history of the family under racial capitalism, the place of Black family life, and then the co-constitution and opposition of what constitutes the white family, a family based on property and accumulation, that the family has always been a white supremacist institution. It's been an institution that is created in opposition to those who are excluded from it, which I think is an insight that partially draws from psychoanalytic theory, is recognizing how things are constituted partially based on what's excluded and what is not counted as belonging among them. And there's a complex political decision to be made in that context, whether to sort of claim a universal participation for those excluded, whether to claim what queer people do, what trans people do, what homeless people do, what Black people do as families. And in many cases, people do understand it for themselves as families, but also recognizing how this exclusion from a consolidated institution and definition has an enormous impact on people's lives and might call on a questioning or rethinking or overthrow of that concept altogether.
Part of what I take is being so powerful in what you're saying here is this idea that this object called the family is overdetermined, right? Both in terms of causal production, but also in terms of meaning, and that allows for these remarkable maneuvers or capacities for flexibility on the part of state and market institutions, such that as you've already unpacked with the example of Black Americans, both antebellum and afterwards, but also the example I was thinking of that came up also in your book quite well is the role of the family, quote unquote, as an abstraction, as being essential to the settler colonial project in the U.S. and how, if one reads various like the Homestead Act or any of these numerous sort of pieces of legislation, there's always this explicit desire to both protect and cause to proliferate, quote unquote, families. And this is, on the one hand, oftentimes like facially neutral. But at the same time, what this actually means are homesteads of white families. And the homestead of the white family in this way both functions as like a unit of social and political production, like literally expanding these beachheads and sort of like the basic unit of social reproduction for a settler state, but also insofar as that it exposes those settler families as interlopers into land that is not theirs and into the inevitable sort of cycles of violence that come from that. The white settler family, as an object of retaliatory violence or of just as it gets caught up in the inevitable messiness of frontier counterinsurgency and becomes an agent of that, then it's the defense of the white family against the supposed other who is, whether they're Comanches or Apaches or whatever, are not only representing an alternative social organization with different types of family and land use and different gender roles, et cetera, but are taken literally to be aggressing against these settler families, or even against the idea of the family as such, or the national family. And so in this way, we have this thing that is the family, which on the one hand is abstract, but also is a literal and functional weapon for liquidating entire categories of people and integrating, this entire nation into a market economy of a certain sort. And that is concomitant also with, as you say, these problems like making the family also being a site of refuge for people, or the notion of family in a certain type of appropriation response to that hegemonic power structure becomes a way for people to have recourse to, get some land, et cetera. So again, overdetermination seems like a lovely way of thinking about this thing as it's a contested overdetermination.
Now, I certainly have a lot to say about that. I'm certainly happy to talk more about thinking about settler colonialism and the way the family has been an instrument of anti-Indigenous genocide in multiple axes and moments and dimensions. And I think what you laid out, that the sort of architects of mass settlement in the Western United States and Western Canada really recognized very quickly that men moving out to the frontier were not in and of themselves able to make a stable society, that creating a white propertied society required women to move. It required forming nuclear families. And there was a very deliberate effort around encouraging family formation amongst white people on the frontier. And then, as you alluded to, the defense of them against Indigenous people fighting back became a huge part of the ideology of America, and it dominates themes in Westerns and all sorts of places, and a huge part of actual imperial military strategy in the U.S. military efforts around frontier expansion. And I might add to that sort of questions of allotment policy, of how the settler project related to collective property relations in Indigenous life, and the very deliberate effort both at destroying care relations amongst Indigenous people through the boarding school system and things like that, and then the reconstitution of those care relations into male-headed private households through allotment, as collectively managed land was redistributed to private families, and this very conscious effort that the fragmenting of of indigenous land would help undermine and destroy indigenous sovereignty. So the imposition of the nuclear family as a means of expanding the settler project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot that I would have wanted to say has been said, which is, which reflects the deep, if you like, kinship between our projects. Whoops. Yeah.
Don't worry. We'll get a chance to undermine the and denature the idea of kinship in like 20 minutes.
Yeah. My little potted history, which is a very different kind of way of telling history, it's sort of a potted history of family abolitionist dreams that are not linked up explicitly, and are not in the case of my different genre of sort of text, rooted in the sort of rigorous historicization of capitalist development that ME is undertaking. But I talk about the fugitive and the fugitive history of, is that a purring cat? I love it. Sorry.
My apologies. She's very close to the microphone.
I love
it. She's named for Alexander Kollontai.
Hi, yes.
Oh,
Well,
really?
Really? Wow.
Cole and Lux, named,
Cole and
of
Lux.
course, for Rosa Luxemburg.
Oh,
yeah. We Kollontai is a thing we would love to talk about too, I'm sure, but let's stay on top. Yeah. We've done an event actually in the context together. We did an event in the context of Dora Garcia's exhibition on Red Love, which is Kollontai's sort of wonderful concept of the antidote to property love in Brooklyn. Anyway, so my one thing I try to do in Abolish the Family is make clear a sort of dual strand history of family abolitionist practice. So there's essentially a strand of this history that comes from, if you like, within the house, the household as constituted, benefiting from the wages of familiality in a bourgeois class society, and that's white. That's part of the wages of whiteness. And then there's this other strand, which you could think of in terms of an undercommons, and it's sort of constituted by what the theorist Joy James calls the captive maternals, being the sort of functions of racialized, exploited, stolen sorts of labors, which are historically foundational to the sort of negative construction of, cis sexual propertied family. And that other sort of outside of the house history of what family abolition means. So not only contains for me this practice of sort of marronage, where people transported violently from their homes and communities in Africa on the American plantation, insisted on maintaining relations with one another that were being purposively destroyed. And so this is a sort of stealing away of the self as related, as kinful, which is why these concepts of kinfulness and motherfulness emerge from this long tradition and are theorized by people from, Kathy Cohen to more recently Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and more as sort of structurally queer in the sense of queerness that I will always probably hold a little flame aloft for, which is a challenge to private property, right? A sort of almost dormant sense of the word queer, But then there's this other side as well, which you've been talking about already, where we could think of abolition of the family as the insistence on not breaking ties of relatedness and care in the context of the stealing of children from indigenous populations and the placement of them in schools where their entire kin-related identity is recoded explicitly and purposively, So It's perhaps paradoxical on its face, but not at all for me, given what we already explained about abolition as proliferation and building, almost as much or as more as it is about negation. When you have campaigns that are ongoing to this day, where Indigenous people are insisting on grieving and claiming and knowing and remembering and unburying their kin who were taken and made in the shape of settler humanity. That is also family abolition, right? I'll also mention that in this context, there are sort of hard and thorny and difficult debates. There's not, within decolonial feminism, within Black feminism, there is a long history of, strategic disagreement about the family. And it's actually, I think, quite generative to place it in a sort of comparative frame with the disagreement about the family that takes place. I mean, obviously there are overlaps, big overlaps between these two things, but in gay liberation, where, in the 60s and 70s in the West, gay militants are disagreeing profoundly about whether there is any sort of road forward for freedom, for flourishing, for queer people in the family form, and in the moment of biggest mobilization in the so-called Red Decade, there's a pretty strong sort of consensus, not only in women's liberation, but in gay liberation with its sorts of myriad projects of, children's liberation as well, that there is no freedom for us, in the family. And this really is mirrored. And then others are saying, that's not true. We want we want the same. We want family, right? That we want that form of humanism. And then in Black feminism as well, this in fact kind of predates the gay version of this fight by a few years, because of the Moynihan report coming out in '65. There's a tradition of sort of Black sociologists in the 1930s, specifically sort of almost preempting. Well, the Moynihan report said to fight against it, but of course the Moynihan report was not the first time that the settler state sort of called Black people a tangle of pathology in terms of their ways of making kin, right? But in the 30s, some Black sociologists were at great pains to say that, the accusation against Black Americans that they don't know how to do marriage and patriarchy, and productive parenting and householding is a lie, And so some of the project there was to do with looking at the archive of slavery and insisting that even under the most dehumanizing and impossible conditions, enslaved people were still doing their very best to be patriarchal, and this is supposed to be a plea, in a sense, for a respectable Black identity, right? And then feminists, in response to the revival of this tradition of argument in the 60s, are saying, you know what, actually, no. Like, what if we need to accept the fundamental, tragic sense in which the Black family, is an oxymoron for us. And this is why the sort of epochal text by Hortense Spillers, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, which, as I think M.E. has alluded to, can be read as Tiffany Letabo King reads it as a family abolitionist argument. But I think, Tiffany also acknowledges its ambivalence as an intervention. That this intervention is talking about the radical sort of absence of meaning-making structures for the Black female subject in America in relation to sort of becoming human. There's this space that needs to be created for the Black female social subject, Spillers says, and the family cannot be the home for that process for Black women, essentially. And it's such an important text. Pat Parker, a few years prior, is an anti-imperialist, communist, Oakland-based activist who's talking a lot more viscerally than that about the need to destroy the family. Spillers is coming from a much more sort of, uncertain place about what the solutions are. I sort of wanted to mention the different sort of tones, in a sense, of the early 70s and the mid 80s, because we have to contextualize, all of this sort of potted history of what Black radicals and feminists and so on have said about the family in the context of how, capitalism is panning out, what the counter-revolution against the Red Decade is doing to people's ability to even imagine or say certain things. So my go-to example of this is, Pat Parker in the 70s, who is the kind of, far to the left of the Firestone, the white Jewish sort of person who gets remembered on purpose, gets constructed as the single voice of family abolition in feminist history for a reason, right? But this is an archive, of far in excess of Firestone, whose decontextualization is, I think, incredibly interesting to think about, like strategically. Like, so if you have a Shulamith Firestone Google alert set up, you will see.
I'm guessing you do.
Possibly. She's my ultimate problematic fave. I think there's plenty I would fight with her about her account of race and her blind spots about coloniality and queerness and so on. But, and I'm not trying to dismiss her at all, but I think the way that the right-wing counter-revolution in the 80s, aided by liberal feminism and the currents within women's liberation that were very eager to walk back the radical demands of the Red Decade and say, okay, there was one crazy lady who said abolish the family, Shuley, and apart from that, feminism has never tried to destroy the family. What are you even talking about? This extreme gaslighting project of sort of historical revisionism and erasure is perfect ammunition, perfect instruments, really, for the right wing to talk about, the dangers, in a sense, of mixing communism and gender liberationist sorts of analysis. You die alone in your apartment, is what they say. They say it a lot on right wing blogs. They use her and her story, but in a sense, the bigger story that we don't hear is the way that the reduction of family abolition feminism in America to this one person, does huge violence to the reality of the perhaps far more dangerous and therefore, sidelined ensemble of, hard, militant, anti-imperialist, nurses like Pat Parker in Oakland, who talked about how, if the family is not destroyed, the American state will rise again, only sort of in a different form. And in this bridge called My Back, you can see the beginnings of the sort of victory of the counter-revolution over the sort of, the revolutionary moment. But there are still feminists of color in that anthology, that very landmark anthology, saying very principled sorts of things against the private household and its privatization of care and the sort of psychical, anti-blackness of the marriage-based family. And that actually, I was just listening to the Dig podcast where Kristin Kobes-Dumez is talking about with Dan Denver about evangelicals, Jesus and John Wayne. And she talks about the fundamental white supremacism of family values so much all the way through. She's saying what family values has been and is a white supremacist policy platform. And I feel like I don't always hear that said. I'm not sure I have even said it quite enough, but I think people who study the right and its agendas are much more clear on that. But yeah, so then at the end of the 80s, you have a very different kind of sort of situation for feminists. And Hazel Carby's epochal sort of landmark of that moment is white woman listen? An attempt to say something really different, in the name of the far reduced sort of political landscape. She's saying white women have to understand that Black people experience family as a site of resistance against the state, and so white feminism can't just be anti-family in that way. And you can really, they're both right, right? But the conditions of possibility for a sort of cross-racial insurgency of care communization have narrowed drastically. So now we have, I think, somewhat of a revival since 2015. I look to very interesting British Black feminists like Lola Olufemi and Annie Olaloku-Teriba, who have been, supplementing Tiffany Letabo King's intervention in academia, about the abolition of Moynihan's sort of quote unquote Negro family, with some, essays, book texts, artistic interventions, social media sorts of interventions about the fundamental family abolitionist tenor for them of Black radicalism. So Lola Olufemi's book, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, I think is a beautiful sort of supplement to Tiffany's reflections on how you can be very committed to the life of the Black intramural and the life of Black sort of techniques and skills for survival and collective flourishing, while at the same time recognizing that the family form that actually, structures almost all life under capitalism, because no forms of extended or queered or alternative sort of kin making fundamentally, negate the private property logic and the privatization of care logic of capitalism, which is why, perhaps in a slightly killjoy way, we insist that it's not enough to talk about chosen family or queer family or extended, expanded, reformed, etc. But to talk about abolition, Tiffany writes that it's so beautiful to me. I when I say if you love the people in your family, that's a great starting point for family abolition. You want family abolition for them. In her essay on abolishing Moynihan's Negro family, Tiffany talks about her own family as a formation that must constantly be reshaped and eventually even abolished in order to be capacious and loving enough to address its own violence and continue to invite in all of those that desire its embrace. And for me, this is a very similar sort of thought to Olufemi's sort of speculative intervention, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, where she invites us to think resistance strategies from the home we will eventually destroy, from the family that is an albatross about our necks, and from the prison of identification. So, I think it's often, and kind of it makes sense that this is the case, from sort of Black abolitionist militants, that we get this understanding of how abolitionism is a sort of orientation for bringing you closer to people, not separating people, but bringing them closer together in order to think about the forms of abundant care and consensual interdependence characterized by autonomy that we wish for ourselves and our loved ones.
I want to kind of linger here for a minute and riff on this, in some ways seemingly deeply counterintuitive idea that if you love your family, you should want to abolish it. I want to bring us to think about an organizing psychoanalytic concept here, which is resistance. And we talked about how the psychosocial is like family problem. There is, I would say in some ways, and I'm thinking this also having taught some of this material too to students, that there is something, and both of you, I think, very, very wisely early on in your books, you're like, we need to reckon with the fact that the very idea of family abolition is something that is going to provoke enormous resistance, right? In this sort of like, but I love my mom kind of way. How can I want to abolish the family if I love my mom? And, I'm thinking, and I have to quote this for our listeners because it's amazing. And I have had my students quote this quite gleefully aloud in seminar. I'm thinking about this line early on in Sophie's book. Sure, it may be a disciplinary scarcity-based trauma machine, but it's my disciplinary scarcity-based trauma machine. It's sort of like, so I wonder if we can talk about the forms of resistance that you two have encountered as theorists of family abolition. And I wonder, to throw another psychoanalytic concept into the mix, which is fantasy, because I take this resistance in some way to be something that indexes the intensity of the fantasy or fantasies that surround what both of you have been referring to as the family form. So I wonder if we can talk about resistance and also what these sorts of fantasies represent and how fantasies of the family function to obscure, the very bleak realities of the harms and violence that do happen within family units, right, behind closed doors.
I end up in Abolish the Family with an attempt to think through the limits of the category of kinship,
Yes.
kin making and kin. And I think this is very much of a piece with, ME's project of looking towards the horizon of communist social reproduction, sort of for the following reasons, in part. Thinking deeply and reading also the immense kind of anthropological literature on how kinship is defined and being influenced by at least once, revolutionary thinkers like Donna Haraway, who write about this very powerfully in the 80s, although kind of pivoting to say other things, quite opposite things in the 21st century about this. I think kinship is an anti-labor metaphysics. So what I mean by that,
you're going to have to unpack that for us.
Yes. So what I mean by this is when you're asking me about fantasy, so I thought this would be a good place to try and get into this. So family is obviously a ubiquitous trope. It's a powerful way of marketing stuff. If you go and take a certain kind of airline or you enter a certain bank or this or that, you will be sometimes told that you are family here. I always kind of chuckle at this because it's an incredible illustration of the power of the fantasy, because statistically, and I don't think this is something that any of us say we don't know at this point. The family is the location of the vast majority of key forms of violence on this earth. We may have been able to say in the 60s in some locations of our social positioning that we were not aware, that the family is where this epidemic of child sexual abuse happens, because, feminist social workers, many of them women of color, had to blow the lid off that fact. And it was traumatizing and difficult to come to terms with for feminist movements and gay liberation movements. And, the sheer facts, the sheer statistics of how if you're a woman, the most likely place where you will get murdered is the family. And that, nothing has changed in this regard. So all of these sorts of things, make it rather incredible, that we feel reassured and safe when someone says you're like family. I mean, I know it's a sort of line and it's a joke, but I truly contemplate this. The fantasy of family is in its own way utopian, and maybe in the negative, but in the pejorative sense of that word, which I claim utopianism as a method of denaturalization of the given, but it reflects a need that is real, and that family abolitionists take, I think, more seriously than anyone. This need for for belonging, for feeling held, for feeling supported, for feeling known, and at the same time, the conditions of possibility for a transformation of the psychical element have to come kind of materially, right? I think it is through building infrastructures that take away this kind of overburdening of the private sphere of legal and biological, or biologically imagined or mandated kin, that we will begin to, find ways to loosen the grip of our sort of proprietary concept of ourselves and what our family is. Kin is a story that says we can't break up even if we want to. When I say, your family to me, even if I say it kind of glibly, and I'm not necessarily prepared to back it up with a bunch of sort of legal documents, guaranteeing your debts or whatever, I'm sort of invoking a value system that is providing some sort of sense that nature has underwritten or created or ordained our bond.
Yes.
And it is not a matter of choice for me to care for you. It is not a matter of choice or a matter of labor. It's not labor. It's sort of automatic, given, natural law that you will be cared for because I'm saying this thing about the nature of our relation, the constitution of it. And now, perversely, I I have this kind of, insistence on saying that all kinship is made, not given, just like I think that all marriages in a sense are green card marriages, like if you follow what I'm saying, like that, the fantasies of these containers as sort of a matter not of labor, but of something sort of metaphysically unshakable. That comes, I think, from a way of organizing social reproduction based on scarcity. I mean, capitalism, so I don't think you can simply get out of that. I mean, there are ways to practice loosening its grip, but I think the scarcity is real. It is difficult to trust that you will be cared for simply as a matter of people's labor. We want to believe, we only tend to feel safe when we have some kind of story about how it's not anybody's choice to care for us, but in fact, their natural obligation and imperative. So that's why I'm interested in trying to, as a utopian, a critical decolonial utopian, thinking about what other ways we might have to name one another as relations and what that horizon of perhaps historically unprecedented red love would look like. It's not the driving force of this process of communization of social infrastructure, but it is, in a sense, the point and the goal and the horizon. Wages Against Housework and Alexandra Kollontai alike are interested in what love might become.
Right.
Perhaps with the same people that we currently love, to the best of our, historically overdetermined ability, in a world where that love is completely, to the maximum extent possible, relieved of economic coercion. So it's love not held hostage, as M.E. and Iman Abdelhadi say rather beautifully, or rather their interviewee in the future, in a world that has begun this process of communization of social relations. Latif Timbers is an interviewee in this oral history of the future, everything for everyone, that is a speculative fiction that Emmy has co-authored. Latif talks about love not held hostage to money or to other sorts of economic things like that. Love is held hostage in many ways to material and economic forms of blackmail. And so, I think it's worth thinking about the attachment we have in the present to our scarcities and to the sort of the ways in which our, what did I call it? Disciplinary scarcity-based trauma machines invite us to cling to them, even knowing that they're not necessarily a full representation of what we feel we deserve, precisely because it's very vertiginous. To touch or to even begin to trace the outer limits of this thought of what we would have to become, because it's a self-making transformation as well, a transformation of the self. Were we, to have a much greater degree of freedom in the way we encounter the people currently in our lives as family.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which I remember reading your book for the first time, like right when it came out. And the word that came to mind, or maybe it's an affect more than anything else, is the idea of the family as something that's fundamentally claustrophobic. Yeah. Like the family is the Hotel California, right? Like you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. That's and it seems to me that like the flip side of that is this sort of freedom that you're looking for.
I was thinking about this, about a lovely line you have here, which condenses many things you just said. Like, when economic crises and or pandemics strike, it is paradoxically our scarcities that we want to hug to ourselves, lest they be taken away, which really stopped me in my tracks. Just a lovely line. And I found myself registered on a bunch of levels. One being just like, well, this is my symptom. This is my suffering. At least this is mine. So don't take it from me, right? At least I get to have this. But also I keep thinking about how, whether it's in the selective historical memories that we've been talking about, right? Like, which, I don't think psychoanalysts or people who are psychoanalytically oriented or immune from it. And Christopher Lasch, for example, his theories of the family get very, very precise about some things and then totally ignore entire categories of persons and histories at the same time, right? But also like the weird interactions one can have, even raising the question of family abolition, as you both described, where it's very clear we're in the realm of taboo, where people be like, yeah, abolish my family, please, but no, wait, don't, right? Like jokingly, we all agree that this is a miserable situation.
Is that like, take my wife, please?
Yes, that's the joke. Yeah, that's right. I'm thinking about, like, we did a couple episodes on like holidays, right? And like every single holiday movie that does well is essentially about how
the horror,
the holidays are terrible. Every family is actually dysfunctional, but dysfunctional is a new type of functional, right? And it's sort of like a faute de mieux. What else are you going to do? Ha 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 ha. And you just hope that the laughter doesn't get too desperate at the end. And there's something about that there that I think about this too, in relation to like, a part of it does feel like a whistling past the graveyard kind of thing, right? Or this desire to just do something. And I think, just to throw another example on the table here, right? I think as the pandemic, both of you allude to a lot in your work, or write about at length, exposes the way in which the family is supposed to do all this work. But I was thinking too, and the analogies to the policing come up here, or the stuff on gun violence is very helpful, I think, in some ways. But I recall during the pandemic, everyone being like, well, now finally, we're going to take our precious children out of schools. They will be home at least. And thus they will be safe from school shootings and mass shootings. And then you even have people be like, well, actually, mass shootings and school shootings have gone down. Isn't it great? And of course, as an empirical matter, well, children were always less safe in the home. Most mass shootings always take place in American homes. And now that our homes are schools, we actually did have more mass shootings. And yet, the invocation of like the idea of the home as a refuge could be used to efface all those possibilities, by at least giving people some sense of like control, or at least of a trope or a space that they could return to. And in much the same way as I sometimes think like the last, or probably the best, or last and best defense of like the police as an institution that we encounter is the invocation of the idea of the police over and against the reality of what the police do as like this ideal, right? Like, well, at least next year, Thanksgiving will be great. Or at least, maybe the police will show up and do the right thing sometime. Maybe there'll be some scenario when I will need them. And in all these kind of acknowledgments of the insufficiency of these current institutions, or of the way, and here I draw a line you have, I mean, it's really wonderful about how like the proper family is one that is able to erase and ignore the broad structural domination on which it depends and successfully masks its internal relationships of coercion and abuse. I'm trying to think about like, other topics or other things where we run up against something that both feels so self-relevant and obviously a problem, but also that is so abstract and so collectively a problem that we both personalize it and abstract it in different directions. We seem to prefer to say, oh, family abolition, you mean Stalinist jackboots are going to cultural revolution my children in the year 2024 in the United States or something, right? Instead of thinking in terms of how the current system strikes against all these needs for care or fails to deliver that. And here I just very granularly, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the compulsion to love or the compulsion to invoke love as a like stopgap for material care or as at least a sign of material care. I almost want to like articulate the idea of the family as it functions in these spaces as it's like a psychic safety net in the absence of there being a material one.
Yeah.
When in fact, in reality, if we were to have a non-scarcity based thinking or to actually think about scarcity, we might raise questions like, well, it's precisely because I love my family and I want there to be care in my family that I don't want the possibility of, say, my having a medical emergency to bankrupt everyone in the family, right? Or it's precisely because I like love the kids in my family that I would not like to have to work myself to the bone in order for and never see them in order to pay for an education that they can get to take their chances, right?
Yes. And it's precisely because I love, sorry for interrupting.
No, please. Yeah.
Precisely because I, perhaps if one is lucky, love my parents, that I object that I am the reason, in a sense, why they laid down their entire lives, decades on decades, in work, in alienated work for a boss, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's our definition of love, in a sense, and it does not have to be that way.
A situation where I want to sort of speak to the way in which, like, we, at least subjectively or anecdotally, I feel like there's some point at which, like, we don't quite have choices for whom we love sometimes, or at least we're forced to attach to people. And part of, I think, the Psychoanalytic Project gets at the difficulties of decathecting or reworking or reflecting on those initial attachments. But
Sure.
in a similar scenario, I'm imagining, like, let's say your father or parent or a mother is a bastard and is abusive, right? And yet I still feel affection for them, even though I've instituted a whole suite of boundaries between them and me. At the point at which, they're in the end of life and they need care, I don't want to have to be put in the position, out of honoring some concept of love, but out of just also like not wanting to deal with it, of like being the person who has to show up at say like my abuser's deathbed to care for them because they don't get basic in-home care as they're dying, right? Or a hospice isn't available, et cetera. And I understand all these other institutions are somewhat fungible, but the idea being that like the invocation of the ideal and the invocation even of the ideal of the family as containing love actually results in compulsory, like, perversions of love or exploitations of love that are really cruel and totally unnecessary.
So I want to wind up here by asking about the positive vision of family abolition. As we move through these intense resistances. But I really want to stress to listeners just, the extent to which there is this profound hopefulness that's just like rolls off of both of your books. It really does. And, the idea of the abolition of the family as a site of privatized care and of scarcity, for both of you, it is also a powerful demand to imagine and to create truly sustaining forms of care. And so, Sophie, you've already brought this up. It's figured in your work in terms of care beyond kin. And for ME, you talk about it in terms of communist social reproduction. So before we go, can you tell us a little bit about this positive vision?
Yeah. So I think in different ways, both our books are really an invitation on people to imagine, to dream, and to desire. That articulating something about the world that we want to live in the kinds of social relations that we imagine might contribute to our flourishing, that this can be an animating, this sort of utopian gesture in the present of being able to articulate our desires, can really animate and work alongside our social struggles and popular movements and fighting for reforms and efforts at building chosen family and efforts at recognizing and appreciating sort of how all these different mass social struggles and collective endeavors start pushing against and beyond the family when people are fighting the state and fighting capitalism and fighting white supremacy, that the overcoming of the family starts to be at play in these mass social movements. And that's something I'm very interested in. And beginning to link that to allowing ourselves to want, to desire a different kind of world.
Yeah.
So it's not an accident that like a year before I wrote Family, Abolition, a Man, and I wrote Everything for Everyone, that Sophie has referenced, that it's like sketching this sort of utopian future of a revolutionary communist free society in the early 2070s. And that's very much family abolitionist and has many different facets to it. But us articulating something about the world that we yearn for, our own freedom dreams. And then, there's a lot to be said. I think both of us have a lot to say about the utopian tradition, that I kind of, on the one hand, reject utopian socialism's sense that if you generate a blueprint and then go around selling it to people, that's how social change works. Like Marx is very right that social change really can only come about through the imminent contradictions of society and the struggles of people in the present, that building the future as they go. And that, a blueprint isn't needed for that, to make that happen, to make that possible. But at the same time, the utopian gesture I really see at play in social movements all the time, and that Marxists have sort of underplayed or undervalued how much talking about the world that we want to live in is a part of how people fight alongside each other. So, there's a lot of good reasons to not say anything too concrete or too specific about a family abolitionist future, to sort of lay out its ethical principles, its political commitments, its sort of inchoate possibilities in the present. But I made the decision in Family Abolition in part because of watching how Everything for Everyone resonated with people, to actually try to theorize something fairly specific about a revolutionary family abolitionist future. In particular, that following this sort of historical survey, I really identified that if you are overcoming the family but replacing it with the capitalist market or a massive state intervention, that's definitely not freedom, right? These capitalist institutions replacing the family, we see at various historical moments with enormously horrific consequences. And so that actually articulating something about family abolition that is simultaneously an overcoming of capitalist property relations and an overcoming of the white supremacist capitalist state as the organizing principle of society. And so I have one chapter where I sort of theorize this abstractly. I sort of identify qualities of communist social reproduction, of what a free society would necessarily entail. And then I have a chapter sort of actually sketching something, right? And drawing on a communization tradition and others, really being interested in the ways that during mass struggles, people start collectivizing social reproduction in the form of like a protest kitchen, for example, in the form of people living on barricades together, or living at a protest camp, or living at an occupation, or what, Sophie's partner has written very beautifully on how looting during riots can become an element of collective survival and social reproduction and support between people, that it's in struggle that people start collectivizing forms of care and moving beyond the private household, and then extrapolating this to imagine communes of a couple hundred people emerging over the course of a revolutionary process, and not as a blueprint, but as an effort to try to theorize something about what revolution might look like, and something about what we might allow ourselves to desire in the present. So I sketched the communes to come as a speculative movement that is unusual in a work of Marxist theory. And this kind of utopian speculative gesture, like some, I think, wiser theorists than me avoid saying anything too concrete about the future, but I thought I'd go for it and see what happens. And that, I think particularly in the form of the novel, like people love Everything for Everyone with an intensity and passion and fervor. Many people have told us that it is their favorite book. And like neither of us are trained as literature authors. Neither of us have much experience writing fiction. We did not imagine this as a masterpiece. We thought it would be a fun thing to do together. And that people love it so deeply and so intensely, I think in part because people are starved for this utopian speculative dimension in not allowing ourselves to have that inhabit our life as a day-to-day practice.
In a kind of transitional demand kind of frame, the good and or bad news, depending on how you feel about family abolition, is that many bread and butter leftist sort of struggles and movements are already at work deprivatizing care. When you make demands for the right to the city, for the right to housing, or affordable housing if you want, or the right to free universal childcare or education, or the right to food, these are all, in a sense, ways of taking certain burdens out of the private household sphere. And Emmy is obviously completely right. That logic of privatization into the family is not in any way fundamentally transformed or improved by the logic of sort of market involvement or like substitution, And this is in a sense what I say in Full Surrogacy Now, which is, I presented it earlier in this podcast as a book about pregnancy, but it's also very much a book about the fundamental sense in which materially human beings are the makers of one another, are already very, very deeply surrogated, if you like. The surrogation or surrogacy of the present is overwhelmingly, not exclusively, sort of capitalistic and colonial, and disavowed and invisibilized in ways that lubricate and allow for this to sort of go on and seem ethically acceptable. But the ways that we currently imagine the family as autonomous are it's never been in a sense true, right? This is why the family is also typically theorized by us and the people in our tradition as impossible. The family is impossible. It's never been a self-contained unit. The stratified character of reproduction on a planetary scale has always meant that there are racialized, invisibilized, sort of, if you like, surrogate labors sort of pouring in through the boundaries of this family, delivering care that the housewife figure cannot do on her own, But the point of Full Surrogacy Now is also to suggest that there is a prescriptive rather than simply descriptive valence or possibility of the phrase, and to say full surrogacy as a demand is to say that, it's not enough that we are already the makers of one another. The task of communistical transformation is to figure out what it would mean to act like it, and not to disavow it, and to be worthy of that fact that we are sort of all linked. It's a vertiginous and in a sense not particularly easy thing to grapple with in our nationalistic and familized sort of way of thinking about the self. We haven't even gotten into the way that the family is a sort of microcosm of the nation state, sort of incubating the basic thought structures of sort of us and them and competitiveness and chauvinism. But this is something that people like Anne McClintock, a theorist of imperialist history, write about very powerfully. The positive vision of family abolition that I'd also like to sort of throw in the mix is one in which the logic of work does not dominate society anymore. For me, the family is importantly understood as a sort of technology of work. It's the family is the reason why, we're supposed to want to go to work, and the reason we have to go to work, as well as the reason, paradoxically, why we can go to work.
Right.
And in moments like, the pandemic lockdown, where we had, phenomena like the Great Resignation or the Big Quit, I think people were beginning to put together some sort of popular forms of sort of crypto family abolitionist analysis. Like, how does it make sense, that it is family values, aka actually, productivity values, productivism and work values that are forcing us diabolically to go to work to put our loved ones' health at risk. Like that is messed up, like it all of it is sort of, like it falls apart at moments of crisis, like, epidemics or perhaps also the genocide in Palestine right now, right? Which I do kind of want to briefly address, because as a person associated with reproductive justice and with children's rights, it seems to me, completely impossible to do any public intervention or any event right now without speaking to the settler colonial genocide going on right now in occupied Palestine. And it's not simply a digression. I want to, of course, simply invoke, a cry for a free Palestine. But for 4 months, I've been thinking about what we learned from the sort of disaster polymaternalism on the ground in Gaza, kind of streaming through into our phones every day. It might seem to some like you can't talk about decolonial, and anti-genocidal pro-Palestinian politics and family abolition in the same sentence. And I would say the opposite is the case for me. You might ask me, like, okay, the Palestinian family, like, haven't you noticed, Sophie, that, at The Hague, South Africa was itemizing specifically these kind of genocidal projects to target specifically the family, the living archive of Palestinian ancestry and material narratives of Palestinian lineages of blood and lineages of breast milk. But as I said, it's central to the politics of any family abolitionist worthy of assault, right? That the family is enshrined in the definition of what is grievable, and in the legitimacy of any sort of people, quote unquote, claims to national sovereignty, as well as being the only thing that people have, right? The only thing people have got. And it is the limits of the family that are touched every day, right? When someone uploads on TikTok something like a video of a person in Gaza distributing candy to children saying, "You are all my sons, you are all my sons," I call this disaster polymaternalism because it's a form of more than familial care born of the most unthinkable tragedy, but which nevertheless makes it rather besides the point to say, oh, the nuclear family would be better than this, I sort of feel the same paradoxically when it's a very different context, but in the US when, we're told to swallow more austerity, more destruction of welfare all the time, there is a sort of tendency on the New York Times pundit class to bewail the way that, working class people and people of color are not marrying, and how there is such a thing as a quote unquote two-parent privilege. Okay, two parents for a child, potentially better than one, fine. Rather obvious point. What's better than two parents? Like 24/7 universal childcare, free housing, 20 parents. I don't know. I mean, the point I'm making is that the fact that the bombs are falling is not a reason to try and remove a revolutionary feminist lens. In fact, the opposite, right? And we do not, as revolutionaries, vindicate forms like the family simply because colonized families are fighting for survival, and we don't romanticize things simply because our enemies are trying to destroy them. We can't become revanchists simply because it is imperial violence that is precipitating the development of alternatives. Yeah, I think we have to understand as well how heavy and unhopeful some of our mindsets sort of are, at the same time as when you ask me about a positive vision of family abolition, I think in a sense about these practices that say all children are the children of all of us, which a Palestinian friend told me was a very common Palestinian saying even before the era of the ubiquitous, WCNSF, the Wounded Child No Surviving Family, right? Which is this kind of new category that we have to think, kinship with in the context of Palestine. And what the beautiful thing that Dan Berger has noticed as well is the abolitionist logic of this notion of children belonging to all of us in the context of occupied Palestine, where the relatives of Israeli hostages, kidnapped by Hamas, were asking on October 28th that everyone be exchanged for everyone. So the demand was formulated specifically as everyone for everyone. And I think the hope, this is not in and of itself, a revolutionary decolonial demand, but its logic, I think, is abolitionist. The logic of us for us and them for them begins to collapse. This is the hope of family abolitionists, the more you remove pressures and burdens on the capitalist, biogenetically imagined private household mode of production. And so if you quote this demand, that is in a way of mobilizing familism or the moral authority of the family against the familism of the nation state, I think you sort of get this vision where it becomes obvious that, these are thousands of Palestinian prisoners, right? And 240 at the time living Israeli hostages. You realize that the everyone for everyone requires a repossession and a sharing of everything, i.e. everything for everyone, which rather beautifully is the title of the novel that M.E. and Iman wrote. And everything for everyone is quite simply what my politics reduces to, and what the still living dream of communization means.
Thank you so much, Sophie and Emmy, for being with us today. Before we go, I will put, of course, links to your many books, between the two of you, many books, in the show notes. But is there any place that our listeners can read you, recently or coming up, or upcoming events, or any of those things?
Well, on March 18th, perhaps this month, depending on when you are listening, to Ordinary Unhappiness, I'm the Women's History Month speaker at the Sarah Doyle Center at Brown University, and I'm giving a lecture on family abolition at 5:30. So you can look that up by looking at the Sarah Doyle Center at Brown University. And if you're interested in the sorts of things that I write, you can always subscribe to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/reproutopia.
I highly recommend Sophie's Patreon. I have a Patreon. It's not as active, but it has all my past writing, which is M.E. O'Brien. And I'm speaking at a bunch of places coming up, but I don't think any of them are easily accessible to the public. The privatization of university space is quite brutal. And I also want to highly recommend the 2 periodicals that I work on. Pinko, we just sent off issue 3 to the printers, and is just magnificent. It's a magazine of gay communism, and issue 3 really has a lot of magnificent pieces. I'm very, very proud that we pulled it together. We recently published a book called After Accountability. It's a collection of interviews with organizers and trying to make some arguments about thinking about sexual violence and accountability and sort of what it means to hold each other accountable in movements. I think it's a quite rich text. And then I'm sure that many listeners of Ordinary Unhappiness are well aware of Parapraxis, a magazine where I'm an associate editor. And it's been a tremendous honor to be a part of, and I think everyone should subscribe. And is certainly one of the, along with this podcast, one of the very exciting things happening in the revitalization and making lively of psychoanalysis in this current moment.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, truly.
Truly. Yeah. Such a pleasure to talk with both of you and to read you together.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure at the same time.
Folks, thank you so much for listening. If we could trouble you to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, we would be so grateful. If you cannot get enough Ordinary Unhappiness, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. And my plug for you is basically this: we do not run ads on Ordinary Unhappiness because we simply do not want to promote things that we don't believe in. This is an entirely Patreon-sponsored podcast. And if you subscribe, in addition to the warm feeling of supporting a community and endeavor that you like, you will also get access to 2 additional episodes per month, including the Standard Edition project, in which we systematically read our way through Freud's 24-volume set, and Wild Analysis, where we let ourselves cut loose a little bit more and do a psychoanalytic reading of a cultural object. If you would consider supporting the Patreon, if you like the work we're doing, we'd be so grateful. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield, Sophie Lewis, and M.E. O'Brien. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell, theme music by Formal Chicken.